all. I hope you're in the right place. This is the session of North American Forests Under Assault. And I could start off with a whole bunch of statistics that you often hear about the devastation of fires that have recently gone through the western United States. But I think I'd like to share a little bit of a personal note on that. I'm John Nickerson. I'm a forester with my own consultancy called Dogwood Springs Forestry. I've worked with the Climate Action Reserve over many years, assisting them with the forest protocol, the Mexican forest protocol. And I work with John Remical here, who's the leader of nature-based solutions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on too. But my personal note is I am also a forest landowner of a very small piece of forest up in Lake County in Northern California. And on that personal note, I managed my forest for many years. It was a beautiful older pine mixed forest, and I used to love to go up there and prune the branches and burn in the understory, and it was looking pretty good, you know, long before all of these fires came along. In 2015, that changed. One of the first big fires in California, well, for a long time, the Valley Fire came through and burned it up. We won the game. We won the game, but lost the battle. The fire did not get into the crown of the trees, but all of my trees were most of my trees died as the result of the fire. And I learned a big lesson that it takes a lot of work and a lot more management and thinning below and reduction of surface fuels to really get the forest prepared for those types of fire. So anyway, today what we will be talking about, we have a panel, a very interesting panel here that will talk about different aspects of the tools that we have. Of course, my story has been replicated many times in California, in the West, and in other places. And now we've got a real challenge on our hand. I was lucky enough with my situation that I had a timber market that I could salvage my timber and sell it to. Now, with the glut of dead trees on the market, many people don't have anything to do with their trees, and so they sit. And what do we do with them? And how do we restore the forest? So what we will talk about today are the tools that we have. You know, what is the condition of our forests? What are the tools that we have? We're here at a carbon market. We're here at the Climate Action Reserve, and we're talking about carbon offsets. What offset tools do we have to incentivize management? And we're going to talk about the economics of this kind of restoration and the economics of loss. So today we have Javier Kinney from the Yurok tribe. Javier is the carbon projects manager with the Yurok tribe. The Yurok tribe has used revenues from carbon projects in the past, so they're believers in carbon projects, to assist with reacquiring lands within their ancestral boundaries. His advocacy for indigenous rights extends to state, national, and international levels. And Javier's down on the end. Emily Hope is a forester with the Canadian Forest Service, and she's part of Natural Resources Canada. Her work focuses on the economic implications of forest disturbances, specifically of pests and wildfires. And Phil Saska is a co-founder and chief scientist with Blue Forest Conservation. He's focused on quantifying benefits of forest restoration projects to unlock private capital, investment opportunities into public and private lands. Now in California, we've been blessed to have CAL FIRE and lots of state resources available to start us on our way, but it's not enough. The resources that we have are focused on the Healthy Forest Initiative, which enable us to thin the understory of forests, and reduce the surface fuels. And I'm sure that Phil's going to talk about some of this and why it's not enough and why it's important to bring in private finance to the table to help out with expanding those applications and getting them occurring in a greater place and much more action. So Javier, I'm going to start with you. I'd like to talk about you and your work with the Yurok tribe. And your perspective is quite different than most, because your tribe has a long-term vision of forest management. And I think you can weigh in on where we've come from and where we're going and what is the condition of our forest from the Yurok perspective. Mm-hmm. Would you like to kick that one off for us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. Again, welcome. We appreciate not only the Climate Action Reserve, but it's an honor to be with our fellow panelists as well. So as John mentioned, my name is Javier Kinney. I currently serve as the Carbon Projects Manager for the Yurok tribe. The Yurok tribe is the largest federally recognized tribe in California with a little under 7,000 tribal citizens. We always start, a lot of our understandings and actions with the love and respect in regards to having been there since time immemorial. So within that, the reason why we got into the carbon markets to begin with, we've always had a wealth system within our traditional culture, circular economies, traditional ecological knowledge. There's no separation between our trees and the Yurok people. We're salmon people, we're tree people, we're prayer people. And so we continue those traditions not only within the contemporary sense, but we have that understanding of how seasons work, the various types of mycelial networks, as well as the purpose of lifeways and cultural traditions. And so to give you a sense, our ancestral territory is around 6% of the California coastline. We go up 47 miles along the Klamath and Trinity rivers. As we focus on that 1.5 million acres to reacquire that, we don't want to wait. And so when we look at the health of our forests, and I see the title of the panel is Forests Under Assault, but we also have a natural resources portfolio, which the carbon projects are just one of that natural resources management and the portfolio approach. And so within the natural resources division of the Yurok tribe, we have forestry, fisheries, our carbon projects, wildlife, and watershed restoration. So as we look at the supposed 100 billion of climate finance, the Yurok tribe is also looking to secure a minimum of $1 billion of that. So I did just return from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, as part of the first indigenous delegation, who is accompanied with President Von Sharp, who is the vice chair of the Quinault tribe, and then again another delegate from the Zia Pueblo. But as we get into these conversations, again, the assault is really that assertion and understanding of indigenous people's rights and that connection. A lot of times we're reddening the green movement, we like to say. A lot of people like things. They like to save seals or whales or fish, but there's no connection between that and the people, which is wrong. So a lot of the climate sciences and the solutions to combat this crisis is going to come from indigenous peoples and indigenous communities. Without that, whether it's philanthropic initiatives, state action, federal action, or again, we also provided testimony to the United Nations providing that recommendation. So we could always follow up if you'd like some of those briefing documents. But as we look at the landscape, and we're also trying to prevent the mega fires that you're hearing of, right? Within our tradition, we fought fire with fire. We had rotating cultural burns within not only on our gathering and harvesting areas, but you had to sustain that. But again, the market-based approaches of today, we've got to quantify those resources. We do sustainably log. We do have that for our lifeways. That hasn't changed. We also are known for our redwood canoes, anywhere from 20 to 40-foot canoes that were both river going and ocean going. So we also assert 200 miles off of the jurisdictional boundaries of the coast. And so those are the types of understandings of what we can do, have that understanding. But as we look at forest management, natural resources management, I'd just like to share with you two initiatives, and I think I'm okay on time. The two is we've just reintroduced the California condor, which is, again, one of the oldest species, which has very important cultural impacts. So they haven't been flying in our ancestral territory for about 100 years. And so again, there's been a partnership, because we can't do it, even though indigenous peoples are stewards of over 80% of the biodiversity in the world. The parity of how indigenous peoples are benefiting are in peril. And so we're assisting to heal that. not only with our actions, but it's going to take money. And so again, waiting the 30 years to litigate is something we don't have time for. So in addition to that reentry of over 100 years of the California condor, on June 1st, we also started the most advanced LiDAR company, having 2 planes and an 8-foot drone. And so we also have a partnership with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in which we're utilizing space-enabled research. So in addition to the dirt foresters utilizing, again, that traditional ecological knowledge, we want to be on the forefront of the programs and coders of the engineers within our aerospace, as well as subsurface and coastal rights. And so, you know, when we come and share that story, a lot of people are like, you know, how can we get involved? And so we'd like to follow up with that. We'd like to share that. Again, we work closely with the North American Carbon World Conference. We also work with countries as well, with the space agencies, utilizing that forward-thinking type of understanding, and that's the trend. If you're not with that, that's fine, we understand that, but this is where it's gonna go. And again, those solutions as well as partnerships with the Norwegian government, the financiers of countries, Statkraft, other private industry players, but the philanthropic initiatives are really gonna take a hold of where we're gonna go. But we are also industry. So we've just purchased a golf course. We have the Yurok Agricultural Corporation, which includes a mill, a redwood lath mill. The end users, again, are Home Depot with those lath products. But we also bought an organic farm. So as we hear circular economy and these different types of corporate actions, we want to set that stage. So we've also set up academic partnerships with Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Pennsylvania, as well as the UCLA. So we're also documenting within training PhDs, but also having the ability to put those theoretical practices into action. But it takes the dirt foresters and the ground troopers who will always be there. So I appreciate that time, and then again look forward to the further conversations as well as questions.
Thank you, Javier. It certainly sounds in talking with you that you're building the infrastructure to monitor carbon, whatever way that goes, as an incentive that you're getting ready for it. So thank you. Emily, I'd like to talk with you about, ask you the question. You focus on economics in Canada with a focus on, lots of challenges there with crown lands, public lands, urban forests. Your focus is on the economics of dealing with some of these disturbances, and can you talk about that, and especially the role of how carbon markets can help in either restoring or preventing the damages from occurring in the first place?
Ooh, sure. Okay, so that is a big question, but probably appropriate because in Canada we are dealing with a really big land area. So when I think of forests in Canada, I'm really thinking of the boreal forest, which stretches coast to coast to coast. And I did look this up. I guess it's about 8 times the size of California. So when we're talking about disturbances in that forest, I think we need to sort of keep in mind that there's only so much we can do at this point. Luckily, the boreal is well adapted to the disturbances that occur there. So the forest is co-evolved with fire, with pests, with native diseases. So there is a bit of a natural regeneration cycle that happens there. When it comes to what that's going to look like in the future with respect to disturbances, there is a lot of uncertainty. Obviously, there's a lot of research that goes on. The organization I'm part of, the Canadian Forest Service, is both science and policy based, and so we spend a significant amount of time looking at what climate change is going to do to the boreal forest and what it's going to do to the disturbances that we see today, and whether or not we'll see new disturbances. So the boreal forest we expect will, shift between a carbon source, a carbon sink as it responds to these disturbances. And perhaps that's where carbon markets and incentivizing sort of forest management objectives can come in to sort of support some of that. One thing, John, I'm not sure if you mentioned the private-public land, but I'm just going to keep rambling along with this. One thing that's a bit of an issue with Canada is that much of our land is considered to be crown land. So technically owned by the federal government, but it's under the purview of the provinces, territories, and First Nations. So those organizations are responsible for sort of managing this forest. They also interact quite closely with forest industry. We have forest industry sustainable management plans that are designed to sort of ensure that there's regeneration happening in the forest after harvest. But obviously this presents a bit of an issue with respect to carbon offsets and the ownership of those carbon offsets. What sort of incentive does a company have if they can't lay claim to 100% of those offsets? So that definitely presents a bit of a barrier when it comes to carbon offsets in Canada. I was really excited today, though, to learn from a colleague of mine from Environment and Climate Change Canada that they are looking at improved forest management offsets produced from public lands. So there is already a offset management protocol that looks at private lands. So there's not a lot of actual private land, so owned by individual organizations or individuals. So this whole new look at public lands, I think, is very, very exciting. There are some protocols within Canada that exist at the federal level. There are also protocols that exist at the provincial level. British Columbia is one example. They did have a protocol in place in the past that looked at improved forest management and deforestation, I believe. I could be wrong. But they were looking at various offset benefit sharing agreements with the First Nations there as a way to sort of incentivize land management and take advantage of carbon offsets and the benefits that can provide. So, Don, does that kind of get at your question?
You start, yep. I'll probably come back with more questions
Sounds
in a
good.
bit, but for now, let's go to Phil. We're back in California here. I didn't mention this earlier, but for those of you who don't know, the Yurok tribe is up in Northern California, farther north than where I live. I live north of San Francisco, a couple hours, in Mendocino County. Where Javier is from is now another 3-4 hours from there, right on the Klamath River. And Phil is here from Sacramento, and he does a lot of, well, I know Blue Forest Conservation is involved everywhere in the United States, but I think you have some focused projects in California. And Phil, I'm going to ask you some questions. You've been involved in trying to bring carbon finance to the table, and not just for private lands, but for public lands. And you've created a very interesting tool. I think it's called what's your name of your bond?
Forest Resilience Bond?
Yeah, why don't you talk about that Forest Resilience Bond?
I can pick that up. Thanks, John. So my name's Phil Sachs. I serve as co-founder and chief scientist of Blue Forest Conservation. We are about a 30-person nonprofit conservation finance firm based out of California, Sacramento in particular. And we are focused on bringing innovative financial solutions to big environmental challenges like forest management and wildfire. When we think about the private capital markets and their role to play in public lands and public forests, we often get the question, well, why would you bring that into a space that is owned by the public and by everyone? But when you look at the need of restoration across just the western U.S., we're looking at a need of about $50 billion on both public and private lands. The federal legislation that's been passed, the investments made by the state of California through the California Climate Investment Program get at about $7 to $8 billion towards that $50 billion goal, which is a great down payment. But we've got a long way to go before we can actually address the challenge at the scale needed. And that's where financial markets can play a role. $50 billion in the financial markets is a drop in the bucket. If you think about just the California pension system investments, that's about $800 billion. So you think about, again, the scales that we're talking about in terms of the need and where capital markets can play, it would be a very easy thing for investors to participate in this market. But you have to make the investments look familiar to investors, right? And so what we do at Blue Forest is really understand what are all the outcomes and co-benefits of forest management. Carbon is certainly one of them. And I'm excited to see some of these wildfire emission reduction credits come into play. Before you had to let the forest burn down and then replant it before you could recognize carbon value, which to me, as a scientist, was a little bit of a challenge. But I'm glad to see some of these newer tools come into play. But there's also a lot of different co-benefits. Javier talked about being, both a tree people and a salmon people. I think with the McKinney fire, which you saw in Northern California last year, you saw the direct impacts and links there is on the Klamath River, was affecting the forests, and then all of that material got into the streams and a lot of salmon died as a result. And so there's a stronger connection here, and so by protecting the forest, we are protecting the streams and the salmon at the same time. And so what we work to do is to quantify all of the co-benefits of forest restoration, and I'll get a little bit into what those are exactly a little bit later. And then we work to sign contracts and grant agreements with both traditional funding sources, so state and federal agencies, as normally would fund this work, as well as new entities like utilities and private companies that are interested in seeing the outcomes of forest restoration projects be realized, whereas right now there's just not enough funding to do that. So based on those contracts, we then get investor capital to do the work immediately, which is important for a couple of reasons. One is you may lose that forest if you wait 10 or 20 years till you have the funding to do the work. The second is the costs, particularly with inflation, are increasing every year. So the sooner you get that work done, the cheaper it is. And then lastly, thinking about the benefits that come from restoring forests, those will be stretched out over 5 to 10 to 20 to 30 or more years. So finance makes a lot of sense in this case, because why try and pay for all of this very expensive restoration work on annual budgets when really the benefits that are accruing will last for many years and decades afterwards, and it makes sense to pay for those benefits when they accrue as opposed to today. I'll leave it there for now, John, but excited to chat more about it in the rest of the session.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up some of the new tools that are coming to bear. Yesterday, John and his team talked about several new tools that are available now, and they are, just to go over what was discussed yesterday. The Reserve is coming out with the Reduced Emissions from Wildfire, the REM protocol, and what it does is it recognizes the climate benefits of being proactive and reducing fuel loads and looking at the probabilities of the emissions associated with high-intensity wildfire versus those that are associated with lower-intensity wildfire. It's very much what California's program does now, because you have to be able to demonstrate a climate benefit. But we're taking this to the private world, or the Reserve is taking it to the private context, to bring in private funds for the same thing. And as an offset, we have to be a lot more precise about the benefits. So that's one tool that's quite exciting, that's going to play a role. Another one is biochars. It's very much a tool that's aligned with the biochar methodology, is very much aligned with this fuel reduction work, because you got to be able to do something with the fuel that you're removing, which is often not commercial size. It's often sub-commercial size, and you can either burn it, which is the most often case with that, but biochar isn't only for forests, but we're here in a forest context, so that's why I'm bringing this one up. So biochar is another tool that's coming to play, and it just is out for the work group review right now. After the work group review, it will come back to the Reserve for their final editing and go out for public review, and then the final editing. So that tool is coming along in the near future. And reforestation. The reforestation methodology has been around for a while. It's gone through some revisions, but I just want to bring it up here again, is that the Reserve has worked hard to make that more affordable by recognizing the climate benefits up front, with projections of sequestration that will come in the future, that's changing the way reforestation projects are financed. What those three tools address are prevention, and restoration. So they help out with both ends of it, trying to get ahead of the disturbance, and then what do you do after the disturbance when it comes time to restore the forest. So I guess, Phil, before we get too far from that, you talked about valuing ecosystem assets. And I don't understand exactly how investors can put their money in, private investors put their money into a fund that you guys are managing to invest in these kinds of actions. How do they get a return?
Sure, that's a good question, and one that we get a lot. So what we do at Blue Forest is work to find a third-party, what we call a third-party beneficiary. So new funding into this source that can cover, again, mostly the work on the ground, but also the interest and fees associated with financing a project. And so oftentimes, state and federal grant resources are limited and can't pay for finance costs as a result of our projects. So we need to bring in new payers into the system, whether those are water and electric utilities that might be affected by a fire happening in their source watershed, whether that's a private corporate who is interested in the carbon and water outcomes of the projects that we're doing, or whether that's a local community or county interested in protecting their road and transportation networks. So thinking about all of those components and bringing those to the table and then stacking the different benefits and the value of those benefits together to be able to repay investors over time. And again, if you're protecting a watershed from fire for multiple decades, it makes sense for counties or utilities to pay for that over multiple decades. So that's where investors get to play the role of really putting in that upfront capital. The other question is, who are we providing financing to? And so a lot of the groups that are implementing restoration on the ground, particularly on federal U.S. Forest Service land, are partners of the Forest Service, local nonprofits, RCDs, tribes. And these groups are often not well resourced, to put it mildly. And so when they start managing grants and funding streams of multi-millions of dollars to pay contractors to do this work on the ground, there's a real working capital issue and a cash flow issue that they have to wrestle with. Reimbursement timelines for these state and federal grants can range anywhere from 3 to 9 months, during which time somebody is holding that debt, and it's often the contractor at the end of the day, which makes it harder for contractors to participate, harder for local contractors to bid on a lot of this work, and to build up their resources to do this kind of work in the workforce capacity, because they can't hold that amount of debt for that long. And so when we're providing upfront capital that can quickly repay contractors within 10 days as opposed to months, that's a real opportunity that we see to not only build local workforce capacity and build local contractor capacity, but also reduce costs, because again, somebody's bearing that debt, and it's often the contractor that has to cover weekly payrolls before that invoice comes in and gets paid.
Thank you, Phil. And Javier, talking about the new opportunities with carbon protocols, do you see that these carbon protocols will be useful for you? And I'd like to hear a little bit more about how many carbon projects you have and how they've assisted you in achieving your goals.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that question, John. Let me start with our carbon project, our portfolio. So currently, we have 3 carbon projects. The first ones are related to is known as Phase 1. It's around 14,000 acres. The second one is the CKGG project, which is around 7,000 acres. And the most recent 2,000 carbon project is known as the Capel project. We have a forthcoming one from one of our conservation partners at Western Rivers, which is also in the Blue Creek watershed, which is a cold water refugia, which is another 17,000 acres. And so as we get that land acquisition portfolio and plan in place, we're continuing to do that. But let me just touch on why, again, we're in that market-based approach. First and foremost, the Yurok tribe is about paradigm shifting, consciousness changing, and going from an extractive to a regenerative economy, both in the traditional economy sense, but also the new digital economy. And so as you do that, the first governor of California proclaimed that it was one of the purposes of Californians to exterminate California Indian people. And so now we're here at 2023 with the same institutions, the financial wealth, as well as the mindset and consciousness changing. And so our actions reflect that. So we've been able to not only utilize these protocols, but our good friends at the Air Resources Board, we do presentations and panels now, both in Oslo, Norway, also at the COPs, which will be in Dubai. But the purpose we have that is that initially, the state of California excluded tribes from the cap and trade program. And so we have a little bit of a differences of opinion when we kicked the door down and said we didn't have no other understanding of that. And so where we're going now, though, is we're part of the largest dam removal project in the world. We're taking 2 dams out in California and 2 in Oregon for those traditional historical fish runs. And then we're also expressing the rights of nature. So we've declared the Klamath River a legal form and body, which we're the stewards of that. And so we're looking at the different paradigms and shifting those in the power structures, and we're making no qualms about it. But we're looking at the new protocols. We're looking at the science base. We have the most employment of biologists other than the state of California at the Yurok tribe. So we believe in science. But again, we also have 3 gas stations. So we're also looking at how those types of industries, because we are industry, but we also have 35% of our tribal citizens live below the poverty line. We still have portions of our reservation that are not electrified. So when we're hearing these commitments to net zero and electronic or electric vehicles, we're going to have a good hard look at that, not only within the infrastructure, but those major shifts of whether it's a pilot project to have 7,000 electric vehicles provided to the Yurok tribe as we set up that infrastructure. So it's going to be a transition, but I hope I addressed your question and appreciate the ability to share
I want
that.
to add on to it a little bit. And with your carbon projects that you have, how many employees do you have that are there working on those carbon projects? And has it helped in your community to build employment?
No, the revenues provided by the carbon projects, we're about a 90% grant-funded tribe, about 10% income generation. This is one of the only pots of monies that we're able to provide for our tribal citizens, but also provide for our natural resources portfolio and management. So we have the carbon program, which is me, and then we also have our forestry department that we work close hand in hand with over around 10 employees. Begin with that natural resources division, we're all hitting all cylinders at all times. But we've also been able to purchase the largest private collection of ceremonial items that was here in Malibu. With those revenues, we also provided the seed money to start the Redwood Adventure Canoe Project. So if you haven't been in a Redwood canoe, we'd like to provide everybody an open invitation to come visit the Yurok Reservation and its district territory. But those are kind of the forward-thinking aspects and initiatives with the revenues that we're using. But we've got to invest in ourselves. You know, a lot of times I'm hearing trillions and billions of dollars, but, indigenous peoples aren't at that table. We appreciate the consultation status, but we advocate for decision-making authority.
Coming back to the public lands theme, it seems like, Phil, a lot of your work is not with so much private entities and private investors. I may have gotten that wrong, but it sounds like a lot of it is with counties and perhaps the Forest Service, public entities. And Emily, same to you, it seems like you do a lot of work with the Crown. Anyway, most of the forests are owned by the Crown, and then the management gets to First Nations or through concessions that are, or I'm not sure how those work out. But how can carbon markets then, how do we address the credit issuance that might come from some of these project types on public lands? Have you thought about that? And Phil, you talked a lot about the ecosystem values. Do these tools make sense to you? Can they be incorporated into your work?
Sure. Okay. John, when you ask whether or not I've thought about sort of how we can, crack this issue of private land and, of public land and credit offsets, I have, but I don't necessarily have a solution. I do think that carbon markets are almost beautiful in the notion that they are trying to incentivize, individual behavior for the greater good. But when it comes to sort of addressing this resource distribution issue and sort of that question of how do we divide up the value that comes from the offset market and between these various stakeholders when it comes to the forest. I think it's difficult, and I don't know what the answer is. As I mentioned, there are some sort of ideas out there. The British Columbia government had that protocol I mentioned. They were talking about the atmospheric benefit sharing agreement. Perhaps we would see something like that at a federal scale, or perhaps something entirely different where credits belong to one organization for a period of time, and then the ownership of those credits transfers to another organization. I'm not sure. So, just some perspectives of my own there.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I know one that the Forest Service and others are trying to figure out right now. From my perspective, I know they're looking at everything from understanding and recognizing various sources of carbon value in our natural federal public lands, to evaluating it following the same protocols that you would use on the voluntary regulatory market, but not putting it on those platforms, to actually being able to sell credit offsets. And that's the suite of options that they are currently reviewing. What I think we need to understand is, one, how does that affect the value of those carbon assets that are held within our public national forests? Because they really are assets. Our public natural resources assets are significant, and these carbon protocols could help address the funding gap needed to, and again, just part of the funding gap, but a significant part of the gap in addressing forest restoration and reforestation where forests have burned. So I do think that they are worth continuing to pursue and develop on public lands. What I think is unclear at this point is whether you can sell them as an official offset or not. And the work that we would need to do then is to work with companies to understand, if they don't need a regulatory offset, can they participate, and are they willing to participate in these programs that, again, have all the same rigor as the voluntary and regulatory platforms, but simply aren't going to be on those markets? Because I know there's a lot of nervousness in the purchasing space about, there being a wild west of carbon and everybody having their own methodology, right? And so I think if we can follow the same frameworks again, that would provide a lot of confidence to those purchasing those offsets to provide that value. And what greater co-benefit than investing those resources into public forest lands that everyone can enjoy?
And that was one of my questions I had for you is, when you talked about the suite of benefits that you're trying to value and seek funds for, how do you quantify them? And you talk now that perhaps these quantification methodologies and the protocols might be of help for that, even if no credits are issued. How do you quantify the other co-benefits?
So acknowledging that we don't want to spend all the money in the world monitoring these projects, but we want most of the resources into doing the good work that is being done. We really look for low-cost monitoring opportunities, which often ties us back somehow to remote sensing, which has its advantages, and disadvantages for certain things. Certainly drones are one of the options that we're looking at to monitor species of vegetation, how that changes with restoration projects, and how that ties back to carbon. We also link forest density to vegetation water use, so we can understand how much water supply is freed up as we pull back these overgrown, overstocked forests. And then we're also pursuing under the understanding of what the public health impacts are of wildfire smoke in our communities. So acknowledging that there's beneficial prescribed fire, cultural burning smoke that is something that we would want to see, versus the catastrophic wildfire smoke that affects both rural and urban communities for sometimes months on end. And that has a real economic cost. And so we're trying to understand, from a modeling perspective, if you restore an acre of forest, where could the smoke from that acre of forest go? Who could it affect, and what are the economic implications of that?
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to put this out to the audience. You kind of heard where each of our speakers is coming from. And, it sounds like we're on our way to getting somewhere with bringing in private finance into this area of, healthy forests and restoration. Does anybody have a question for one of our panelists? Yes.
Hi, my name's Will. This is a broad question. I don't know if you guys have a specific answer to it, but we're a nature-based CCO producer in Northern California. We're actually very close to the Yurok tribe. And we operate about 20,000 acres of forest land, and we have a pretty significant prescribed burn operation that we routinely pass through all of our properties. Currently, there's very little incentive to harden your forests to make them more resilient. From a CCO or from a carbon offset sales perspective, there's really no advantage. If anything, it's just more risky because you're potentially damaging those forests, when in reality you're making it more resilient to wildfire. Do you see any changes potentially happening in the regulatory space or from a program and funding space where forest management people and management organizations can get funding or be incentivized to actually practice active management rather than being incentivized to just do nothing and let their forests grow?
I could take that, or you as well. So what we've realized, and again, I'm just going to use the analogy of the dam removal. So, Warren Buffett and his team were the owners of Pacific Corp. So what we've been able to brief not only legislatures, but again, the appropriations and the budgetary processes is if it's in their economic interest, people seem to move faster and quicker and harder. If there's an investment in fire prevention, we understand CAL FIRE, we understand the Forest Service, but you've got to get in those budgetary processes, right? Because they're asking for monies as well, whether it's from the legislatures at the Capitol or Congress. And so I think because we were ignored for a long time. People are like, fight fire with fire? Like, what are you talking about? It's not what we do. And it doesn't say Yurok, but now you have the National Park Services on Bald Hills Road implementing exactly those techniques. You have the state of California now seeing, so we have a lot of veterans at the Yurok tribe. And if you know the chain of command of the CAL FIRE, you have an understanding of what that might look like. So we've been able to navigate that. Within our carbon projects, we're going to be making likely the argument that the risk reduction should be incorporated with these types of actions, right? Not only for basket materials or the landscape, but for the safety and the critical infrastructure of not only tribal assets, but non-tribal assets. So if you look at the watershed and the jurisdictional sort of misconception, so Humboldt County, Del Norte County, Yurok tribal lands, what benefits the Yurok tribe benefits everybody. And so we're looking to do that in a very succinct way, but it's taken some time. It's taken the policymakers, but now they're coming to our ancestral territory as well. And I was just sharing yesterday, and I think that's the ability for partnerships and information sharing. So in 2018, prior to the Climate Action Summit in San Francisco, we had about 30 countries on the Yurok reservation. Some of those appointees of Lula's cabinet were on our reservation looking at how they do that. And so we're a direct action tribe, and we take action. But again, I think if you have that economic threshold, it's in your best interest. I think we're also looking at the insurance industry. So who's actually backing our assets, right? And is it the 5 companies across the pond in London? So we're really tracking that down. And so we're self-insurance on our side, but again, we're looking at how can we make sure that we're in a state of emergency right now because of the weather that we've had. And so that's what we're looking at. And I hope that answered your question, but that's what we'll continue to do. And it's in your economic interest to invest now rather than pay later.
Yeah, and I think, I think there's 2 aspects of that. One is that is one of the things the wildfire emission reduction protocol is meant to address. And from my understanding with that, the developers of that, prescribed burning is one of the highest kind of cost benefit results that you can get from treatment and value from avoiding future emissions. So that is starting to be recognized. I also think, the other value of that is what John experienced on his land, right? It wasn't that severe of a fire, but because the ground burned so hot or there was so much material, those trees died anyways. So it is an asset protection strategy as well. And we think about that on private and public lands as well, thinking about protection of adjacent private assets as well as any infrastructure that might be adjacent to or going across those lands. And so the other thing I would encourage is to think about engaging those like Pacificor or Pacific Power and others that might have transmission or distribution lines and may be interested and willing to participate and even help fund some of this work.
With those questions, with your question and the discussion about, I heard biomass energy theme in there somewhere. What about infrastructure? And where are we at with infrastructure to support some of these programs? You guys have any thoughts on that? Biochar is a form of infrastructure, right? But what other infrastructure improvements can we make? And do you engage in that with your work? Phil, I'll start with Phil on that.
Yeah, so one of the challenges as we've been successful at funding and financing large-scale restoration is we've created a new problem, which is biomass piles on the forest that are meant to be piled and burned, but often are never burned just because there's not the right weather window or not the right capacity from a human resources standpoint. So how do we do better with that material? And what we've been looking at is working with our partners at AAA Insurance of California, who is an investor in our forest resilience bonds. We launched a California Wildfire Innovation Fund last month that is a fund specifically to invest in wood utilization. So thinking about biochar, thinking about bioenergy or biofuels, thinking about post and pull facilities, compost, mulch, kind of any material that can be produced from what's currently non-merchantable piles. And so the nice thing with that fund is it's meant to be a very flexible source of capital to these projects. So oftentimes these projects will be conceived, they'll get a grant from state or low-cost loans from federal agencies, but they need some sort of additional junior debt, mezzanine debt, or equity partner as a result to provide the confidence to actually secure those large debt investors. And so what we're hoping with this fund is that we can play that catalytic role where we can be that partner to wood utilization efforts on the ground, some of which we know have been in the works for over a decade at this point and just haven't been able to get off the ground. And so if we're really going to solve this wildfire challenge and this forest management challenge and complete restoration projects through the end, we need to get those piles off the forest and actually, ideally have a better carbon outcome as a result of it, because you're not just burning those piles in the forest, but you're actually making something with them or producing energy from them as a result. So that's how we're starting to play in the infrastructure space of, providing feedstocks, providing transportation, chipping, equipment, all of that needs to go into the entire system to make it work, not just the work on the ground.
Did that answer your question? Get it farther down the road anyway. Other questions? Yes. Can everybody hear the comments? Okay, please, I'm going to ask if you could repeat that or summarize what you said, but please speak up real loud to make sure they can hear it too.
I'm with the company Colonial. We've given $25 million, or we will be giving $25 million to the National Forest Foundation to
Yeah, that's great. And to repeat one more time for folks that didn't hear, you're from Tellurian, who has partnered with the National Forest Foundation, providing $25 million to reforest a lot of the burned landscapes that we now are experiencing, and acknowledging that, you know, that transparency of protocols and using the same, you know, data and inputs and methodologies as on the voluntary regulatory markets would be enough to increase investment based on, you know, using that, again, same pattern, same data. So that's exciting to hear, and you know, confirming what we hoped, I think, depending on what the Forest Service decides to do with their policy, which I think will come out by the end of this year.
Yes.
Hi, Ken Gilgas with Conservation Resources. This is a question for Phil. Sort of a thought-provoking question, but I mean, 40 years ago, the U.S. Forest Service got 10% of its budget was budget fire. In the last couple of years, it's been about 50%. And if trends keep going the way they are, by 2030, it'll be about 80%. So I think about incentives, right? And the Forest Service in many ways is incentivized to keep managing fire because that's how they expand the budget, right? Emergency fires cause more funding to flow through. And so aren't you in a sense fighting against the machine by trying to, you're putting band-aids on this. And then I look at what private forest lands are. The impacts on private forest lands are much less impacted than on public forest. So public forest lands are what's the problem. Isn't the solution, I know this is California and it's never going to happen, but isn't the solution not to have the public lands go on?
A lot there. So you know, tying it back to one, the Forest Service budget is increasingly going towards fighting fires, and so isn't there some incentive to continue to fight those fires because it increases the budget, and then kind of the agency, and then the other component where, you know, can we get other entities to manage the public lands and perhaps in a way that is more efficient than government can do, acknowledging the inefficiencies inherent in government. From the first part, it was the case for a long time, until a couple of years ago when new federal legislation was passed, that the Forest Service agency budget actually wasn't getting any bigger. It was just more of that funding was going towards the fires and away from all the other needed programs. So I think the agency budget stayed fairly flat for about a decade between 2010 and 2020. And as you pointed out, flat budget, more of that money going towards fires, that resulted in kind of part of the problem that we're dealing with today, which is the lack of management that occurred as a result of that. And interestingly enough, we as Blue Forest cannot use the fact that there would be cost savings from reduced suppression of fires as a justification for the agency spending increased resources on restoring the forest on the front end. So we can do that with utilities and others, but we can't do that with the Forest Service. That's not an allowed kind of justification for funding a project. Again, interesting enough. As to, you know, the second component, you are starting to see that happen, right? We have a large amount of federal funding coming through the agency now. They are starting to expand their workforce slightly, but not enough to keep up. And so they're actually pulling in a lot of partners to help them, you know, manage these forests in a way that, one, I think, is a more community-based approach. So you're starting to see, you know, more effectiveness and more community buy-in. But there's also more flexibility with that, right? There's more flexibility in contracting, in hiring with those partner organizations where, again, we provide financing to, in a way that does make some of the work easier than if you went through federal processes and regulation on kind of every component of a forest restoration project. For instance, you can incentivize contractors to harvest timber sooner using a partner organization. You can't do that in the Federal Forest Service. You're going to get paid the same if you cut on year one or year 5, and as a contractor, you're going to cut on year 5 because that timber is going to be worth more on year 5. So that is some of the innovation that we're looking to do with these partner agencies in a way that, yes, hopefully builds a system that more effectively manages the forest. But yeah, I don't think you're going to see wholesale release of federal public lands or even state public lands to outside management.
So more efficient partnership on federal lands. I wonder if anybody else on our, here has a comment on that, on partnering with the Forest Service to manage land. Or,
So tribes have, there's a trust responsibility from the federal government to tribes and tribal lands. I think what's important to keep in mind as well is, so we're also doing prairie restoration. So all of our forests aren't necessarily the native species that should be in our forest, both on our lands as well as federal lands neighboring. So we're 80% of the National Park Services is within the ancestral territory of the Yurok tribe. Over 70% of U.S. Forest Service lands, again, are within the ancestral territory of the Yurok tribe. So when we've tried to transfer those lands as well by legislation, there was some hesitancy, is actually outright opposition to that. But what we're looking at now is that co-management both at the state as well as the federal levels. So as we do, again, those traditional practices, because we know where those prairies are, we've got to extract those as well, but also restore. And it's just not about planting trees, you know, for us. One of the largest challenges for the U.S. Forest Service in the Six Rivers National Forest is just that. There's not enough people, there's not enough resources. So we did put in a request for 2 Black Hawk helicopters because of the firefighters as well as the fire region. The end game wasn't to get 2 Black Hawk helicopters. The end game was to set up the infrastructure for those helicopters to land. So when there is a time of need, that the Yurok tribe will be able to service that sort of infrastructure request. And that was the partnership with the Forest Service as well as the tribal liaison and advisors. And so we do get time with them, again, at those international forums as well.
thank you, Javier. I just wonder, we have about 3 minutes left, and I just want to make sure the panel has said everything that they want to say, as if there's a closing note. And I'll ask you that before I ask for another question. Is there something else you wanted to say?
I think questions are
Okay,
fine.
then I'll take another question if it's out here. Yes.
Hello. With respect to the bioeconomy, so I should preface this by saying that everything I'm about to say is my own opinion. But with respect to the bioeconomy and sort of working with First Nations, I think you're right. I do think that there's been some progress, but there's still a really, really long way to go. Now, I've got a little bit of experience in the bioeconomy. I know there's interest in sort of using some of that forest biomass. So the slash piles that we were talking about earlier, pelletization, you know, ensuring that there's equitable distribution of resources, and even promoting First Nations projects. There's a community, White Sands First Nation. They are looking at managing their own forests and harvesting and using the leftover biomass to, you know, run their own bioenergy cogeneration plants, and then spreading the ash that's produced from the facility back on the forest, so it's recycling those nutrients. So that's one very specific example, I think, that's really fascinating, and, you know, it's something that we can hope for other communities across the country. With respect to reconciliation, in context of wildfire, I think like, that's one of my areas of interest. I do think there's still also a long way to go in forest management in general. So again, I'm not sure that that really answers your question. I'd certainly love to have a conversation with you later, but hopefully it sheds a little bit of light on my perspective.
So we're at time, but there's one more quick question. If we can keep it quick, let's do it.
So what you're talking about where the atmospheric expenditure was done through federal government and the First Nations group with their ABC was actually not voluntary conservation by Nickerson. And I think it was a really good precedent-setting example of how the First Nation came together with the province and the federal government to negotiate that atmosphere shared benefit agreement. And I think that's something that we can really mobilize. And I think the conservation protection program, they have started talking about that mechanism as well as the IPCA agreement with the nations on peatlands and on forest and all that. But let's keep it there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the future, so it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I'm glad that we ended on a very positive note. And I want to thank you, Javier, Emily, and Phil. Thank you so much. And thank you for attending this one.
Thank you.